Welcome to the Bret Boone podcast. I am Bret Boone, and today on the program, I sit down with a man that's been part of my life for a lot of years, part of the Boone family's life. He's an eight-time All-Star. 1984, he's a World Series champion with the Detroit Tigers. He's got a book coming out. That's why we're having Lance on today. The Enchanted season, it's called. The Detroit Tigers' historic 1984 World Series run and my life as the big wheel. Ladies and gentlemen, the big wheel himself. Lance Parrish. Lance, thanks for coming on.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
Lancer, I'll tell you, the big wheel, although I wasn't around for the big wheel days, it's now it's kind of one of my favorite nicknames. Give me a little big wheel background, short version.
The interesting thing is I did not put how that name came about in the book itself. So I don't know what I was thinking, but it's actually, as you mentioned on the cover of the book. So the story behind that is and it could have been in 84. I'm not sure. 83, 84, somewhere in there. In the beginning of the season, we were scheduled to be on This Week in Baseball, hosted by Mel Allen. And as everybody knows, that was kind of the go-to for the weekend to watch highlights from the baseball week. Mel Allen had a very popular show. Since we were the featured group that week, we came in after batting practice on a Saturday afternoon and all sat down in front of our little TV in the clubhouse. And Mel Allen opened the segment by saying, "The wheels of the Motor City are turning." And they started showing little highlight clips of Gibby and Tram and Jack and Lou and Chet and everybody else. And as they progressed into the segment, I guess during that particular week, I must have been exceptionally hot at the time. So when he broke to me, it was like, and now the big wheel. So as soon as he said that, that was like etched in stone in our clubhouse. That's what everybody called me from then on, was the big wheel. So the way I look at it, I could be called a lot worse things. So big wheel works for me.
I love the big. It's great. It's short. It's simple. It's kind of I don't know. It's not. It's kind of flattering. Like, yeah, hey, I'm the
Yeah,
big wheel. I'm the
I
big
like to
wheel.
say.
Well, it's kind of like the straw for Reggie in New York.
Exactly.
Very cool. I know this isn't your first rodeo writing books because I wrote one and I was one and done. It was it was very for me. It was very educational, but it was different and it was long. I got a question for you. And this is I went full Monty on my book, Lance, and I did probably 10 years ago. Um, they come out nowadays, especially, they come out with the audio version. And for the audio version of my book, reached out to me and said, "Would you be the voice on your book?" I said, "Well, how much are you going to pay me to do it?" That's always the question. They gave me a pretty good per diem for sitting down, and I thought, yeah, I'll knock it out. That was the longest process. And you
No.
know how I don't know if you're like me, but even on this show, I can't stand hearing myself talk. Like when you play it back and you hear that voice, it's not what we hear in our mind.
Exactly.
And I think everybody's kind of similar. They don't recognize the voice that we actually sound like because
No.
we're in our own head. But I had to sit there and listen to myself for days on end. I forget how many pages my book was. Uh, but that was one of the toughest parts because you'll read a paragraph and then, you're in that studio and they'll call, yeah, could you read that sentence again? And for 250 pages and you're
Exactly.
enunciating. So did you do that? Have you ever done it?
I have not done it, haven't been asked to do it. I was always wondering if this particular book would have an audio version. I don't even know the answer to that. So I have not been approached to do it. So my assumption is it will not be in audio form, but you never know. But I can only imagine if they ask you to do it, just like you were asked to, that it would be an endless uh, pursuit.
Yeah, you sit in this like bulletproof room. They make you real comfortable on a
Yeah,
couch. You got the mic right there, and you just read meticulously
right.
through, and it's
Can't make
just
any mistakes either.
right. And if you make the slightest mistake, it's nope, got to redo it. And
Yeah.
I haven't read too many books cover to cover, let alone read every sentence of the book perfectly. So that was an interesting experience I had with my book. This year's the 40th anniversary.
Yeah.
I got a question for you. In life, when you're at an event, you're signing autographs. When people come up to you, how often is it about that '84 season and people have memorabilia from that season?
Oh, all the time. It's when I, obviously you know, 84 was a big year here in Detroit, and that season was enchanted, so to say. And every card show, autograph signing session that I go to, everybody has 84 memorabilia, um, or referencing 84 or they want me to sign 84 world champs or whatever. So there's always some connection to that 84 team. And as I've mentioned before, fortunately for myself, I was able to get into the postseason one time in my career, and that was it. I played 19 years at the major league level and was only in the postseason one time. So having the opportunity to experience ended up doing in '84 with the season we had was pretty special. So that's kind of the way everybody feels around here, and we're waiting for another World Series champion to surface here in the Motor City. But it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, Detroit. That was the last World Series champ. I think Detroit has had 4 World Series
Correct.
championships, and you were the last in '84.
Yeah.
I was going over before we do this show today. I was going over the history of Detroit, and it brought back Grandpa Ray, and he
Sure.
had some big years in Detroit in the
Sure did.
'50s. It's kind of cool to reminisce and go back and see because it's a historic city. I remember Old Tiger Stadium when I first was a rookie coming up. I got to play at Old Tiger Stadium before the
Yeah.
new one. Pretty cool. And I knew that I used to look at it on TV and I thought, wow, he hit it in the upper deck. And now I saw Bob Boone hitting him in the upper deck, and I knew something's fishy about that upper deck. Come to find out, sometimes you can hit it a shorter distance and still touch the upper deck. That was some of the uniqueness of Old Tiger Stadium.
Yeah.
Lance, when did you decide that you were going to write this book?
Well, as you mentioned, this is the 40-year anniversary of our championship season. So I think the idea came about through Triumph Books, the publisher of this book. It was their idea to put something together to commemorate that year. Um, Hooked up with Tom Gage, who is a local sports writer, covered our team for, gosh, I don't know, 20 years or more, and is actually in the writer's wing of the Hall of Fame. So he's had a very successful career, and we were asked to corroborate on this book and are co-authors of it. So it was I agreed to do it. I thought it would be a fun project. It's always a little bit more than I anticipate. To be honest with you, I agreed to do it only because I thought that it would just be focused on the '84 season. It turned out to be a little bit more about me and my, years growing up in high school and, into the minor leagues and whatnot than I had anticipated. But, I'm sure it worked out okay. All things considered, I've already talked to some people that have read, the earlier versions that have come out, and they're pretty happy with it. So, as long as it reads well and doesn't bore anybody, I'm happy about the deal. But Triumph was the one that came out with the idea, and I think it was a worthwhile venture. I'm sure that this gives those fans, whether they were alive in '84 or they're baseball fans now, the opportunity to relive a pretty special season here in Detroit.
The city of Detroit, uh, it's a great sports town. Right now, it's the Lions getting to the playoffs a year ago, so
Oh,
everything
yeah.
is Lions. '84 was your team. You guys went wire to wire, won 104 games. Um, what do you remember away from the ballpark, away from the yard, about day to day life in Detroit, just being out and about? Because it's a unique city, and I've been there a ton of times, but what do you remember, especially back in those times in the '80s when the city was buzzing with the Detroit Tigers? Just life away from the ballpark, how it was.
Well, I'll tell you what. From the moment that I set foot in Detroit, I realized that we had an extremely large fan base for our baseball team. The Tigers are huge here in Michigan. And even when we weren't so good when I first came up, we always seemed to draw pretty good crowds, and it continued to build in numbers until the '84 season. You know, I guess the thing that surprised me that I wasn't really here for very long, and when I would go out in public, people would recognize me. That was kind of a shock to me. That that would happen whether going to a grocery store or where have you. But in '84, when that year rolled around, especially since we got off to the start we got off to. I mean, once we went 35-5, the whole world was in tune to the Detroit Tigers, especially here in Michigan. And basically, nobody on our team could go anywhere without being recognized. And the city was buzzing. They obviously started showing up more and more, and we were packing the stadium before you know it every night and every day. And, the one thing that I do remember was everybody was talking baseball. Everybody was in a good mood. Every time I went to the ballpark, everybody in the ballpark was in a good mood. The clubhouse had a great atmosphere all the way through the season. So for me, it was a magical season. It was an amazing season in that regard because, I was always hoping that we would get to experience that more than once. I thought after the way that we started, 35-5 and going wire to wire and winning the whole thing, that we were going to be able to accomplish that a couple more times, and that was it. That just should go to show everybody that winning at the major league level is not that easy. You have to be consistent and put a good team on the field every year.
I look at that team. You started off 9-0, 18-2, 35-5. Um, I had I got to play on some fun teams, some winning teams in Cincinnati. I was on a great Braves team in '99, and then the 2001 Mariners I played on that won all those games. So I've had three or four kind of that real serious winning feeling. I was reading some quotes in the book about some of the players, from spring training to September when you had a huge lead in September, and I think the the message I was getting from the players was this isn't a time to hold up and take anything for granted. We really have to go into this postseason and really not take anything for granted. And I look back on my years, and I was wondering if there was anything that you in your long career that you remember. But I remember the '99 Braves team that I was on. One similar 103, 104 games. We got whooped in the World Series by the New York Yankees, but that team never took anything for granted. We went into every series, and man, it was going to be a dogfight. The 2001 Mariners that I played, I won 116
I
games,
know.
and it wasn't an arrogant team at all. It was a veteran team. It was a humble team. It was a confident team, and you can't help but be. I've never seen anything like it. I've never won at that clip. Nobody has. And I think that team did start to take things for granted. It was almost like it's a foregone conclusion each series we went into. We got to the postseason. It was a foregone conclusion we were going to beat the Cleveland Indians in the first round. We barely did, but we didn't worry. We went to play the Yankees, and we had handled the Yankees during that season pretty well in the regular season. We went into New York, and it was like no other team I've gone in. Like, all right, guys, come on, we got to win this series to get to the World Series. It wasn't like that. It was like, no, of course we'll win this series. That's all we do is win. And the next thing I know is being on that bus afterwards after getting beat, looking at my teammates like that didn't just happen, right? We're having a dream
We were
season.
supposed to win, yeah.
Right. We this is not how it ends
Right,
in the dream.
right.
And like I said, it wasn't from an arrogant vein. It was just we won so much that we expected it, and we didn't take any series real serious. Like just roll it out there, and this machine gets it done. Ended up being a lesson to us that no, you can't take it for granted,
Mhm.
especially in the postseason.
Sure.
But all your years, and especially that '84 year, uh, did you find anything the years where it didn't work out? Like you said, you got to go to the postseason one time, and you made the most of it. But is there anything now being through the whole thing and winning the World Series? Is there anything that stands out to you that I see what a winning team? So in today's modern day, 2024, you watch a World Series. Is there any one thing that stood out with your ball club that you said, "Oh, that's why we won"?
Wow.
Because
Well,
I never won, so I don't know.
yeah. Well, I mean, you were knocking on the door. Obviously, you were on a great team, few great teams. In fact, I will throw this out there that thought you should have been the MVP of the league in 80 or in 2001. So, had an amazing year. Um, for us, I think it started. The great thing about our team was a lot of us went through the minor leagues together. I think we became a tight knit group early on. Once we got to the big leagues and Sparky came over and started to mix and match and put the pieces together, I think the one thing that he always tried to keep us aware of was that we could not beat ourselves. That if we expected to be any type of a championship ball club, we had to play consistently. We had to play mistake-free baseball. That was a big thing with him. And I remember in '84, if he said it to us once, he said it to us 100 times. Can't afford to let up. Can't afford to take your foot off the pedal. And especially that year, if you recall, Toronto was on our heels. Quite a bit of the way through the season. It wasn't actually until later in the season when we were able to play them head to head that we actually put a little distance between ourselves. But even after the 35-5 start, I looked in the paper and Toronto was right there. They were playing pretty good baseball too. But as the season progressed, we had a great start to the season. We finished strong, but in the middle it was a grind. It was a grind. We played a little bit above 500 baseball, but it wasn't like we had set the world on fire from the beginning of the season till the end. We ended up winning 104 games. We set a franchise record for wins, granted, but I recall that before the season was over, the regular season, we had played a 4-game series against the Kansas City Royals in Detroit, and they swept us. And that was the team that we opened up with in the playoffs. So we knew what they were capable of. And I probably mentioned this to you before, but I got behind home plate on that very first game in Kansas City to start the playoffs with Jack Morris on the mound. And the first thought that went through my head, and I'm sure you can relate to this, if we don't win it all, this season's going to be for nothing. All the things that we've accomplished, nobody's going to remember. We're just going to be another good team that didn't get it done. And even though you guys were obviously great enough to get it done, that just shows you that anything can happen in a short series. But, we swept Kansas City and, we ended up winning 4 games to 1 over the Padres in the series. But, it was one of those where I think once we got into the playoffs, I think we stepped our game up to the next level. I don't think that anybody on our team took anybody we played for granted, and we were on a mission, and Sparky reminded us of that every single day. And, we went out with, that killer instinct that I think you need to have. And we obviously got it done, but it was just a great year.
Yeah, it's awesome. And believe me, I'm envious of that because I know that feeling that if we don't get it done, it's all for naught. And then and then they put an asterisk next to your season and say, hey, really good season, but you didn't finish it. Almost has a negative connotation to it. But you know what? Life goes on, and I was blessed to just be able to experience the things I experienced throughout
Oh,
my career,
absolutely.
and
You had
that
a
was
great
one of them.
career.
Yeah.
You had a great career.
Um, did you? I remember having a moment in my one and only World Series that I got to go to. Like I said, I got whooped by the Yankees. But for you, did you have a moment that stood out for you in that '84 season? Once you got to the World Series, where you kind of looked around and said, "Wow, I'm here, and we're on the brink of doing something pretty big."
Well, I can't even, it's hard for me today to even comprehend the fact that we started the season 35-5. And even though that doesn't guarantee anything throughout the rest of the season,
Mhm.
I remember going to the hotel room in Anaheim. We were playing the Angels after we had won our 35th game to go 35-5. And I just sat down there and I thought to myself, we've just played 40 games at the major league level, won 35 of them. Start to see. That just doesn't happen. I don't think it'll ever happen again. I'll be shocked if it does. But, that kind of not only was a great feeling, but I think it put a little extra pressure on us as a ball club that, nobody starts the season 35-5 and doesn't finish the job or doesn't end up winning at all. So I really felt like, maybe there were times when we pressed a little during the middle portion of the season to try to live up to the expectations we had created for ourselves. But we ended up getting it done. We ended up putting some separation between us and the Blue Jays and the rest of our division. But once we got into the playoffs, into the postseason, like I had mentioned, it's a whole different ballgame. It's now you have to really prove what you're made of, because you're going against the best representatives, not only in your league but the other league, if you're lucky enough to get there. So, at first I thought when we had swept the Royals that probably looking like we were going to play the Cubs. We sat at home and watched that last game between the Cubs and the Padres, thinking that was probably a better matchup. We thought that the Cubs were probably a little better than the Padres, but hey, the Padres pulled it out. We ended up playing them. And, off we went to San Diego. We had our bags packed and we're ready to go. So that was a fun time. But, I will say that for that one brief moment, like I mentioned, when that thought went through my head about if we don't win at all, it's all going to be for nothing. Once the series started, it was like I never thought about that again. It was just focused on what I had to do, what my job was, what any situation presented, that I had to be aware of and take care of.
Started in spring training. Sparky's at the helm. He was the captain on those big red machine days. And I was reading through the spring training part of the book,
Right.
and you had a lot of insight on key players that you didn't know if they were gonna re-sign with the Tigers, and then they ended up doing it. I remember Wilcox coming to mind. Like, we didn't know if we were gonna get him, but there were a few others. So take me from spring training, how it all started, what it was like in camp. Because I think Wilcox was quoted as saying something like, "I've been here for the bad. I want to be here for the good."
Right.
So he had a little insight on that team that you put on the field, that chemistry between that team. I think Darrell Evans ends up joining that team that year in the DH role. But take me through starting from spring training of that year, and what was the buzz? What was that? Was it a typical spring, or was there something special about it?
Well, I think the buzz actually started at the end of the year before. We ended up coming in second behind Baltimore in our division in '83. Baltimore was a great team, but we felt like that we were better than Baltimore, even though they won our division. They were a great team. We ended up having a better record against them than they had against us in '83. So going into the spring of '84, it was like, okay, now we've proven that we have arrived, that we should be able to compete for a championship, and we need to dial it up a notch or whatever we need to do to put ourselves in a position to be in the postseason. Started out, Milt Wilcox, I think, was the first piece of that puzzle. I don't know exactly when he re-signed with the Tigers, but he opted to come back. And I'm glad that the Tigers brought him back. That I thought he was probably one of the most competitive guys on our pitching staff, and he was a veteran presence. I felt like he still had another couple good years left in him, even though that year '84 proved to be his last hurrah, really. But he had a great year. It was a great competitor for us all the way through. Went through an awful lot to stay in the lineup. I will say that. He had a lot of things going on with his arm, but somehow he managed to stay in the lineup, stay in the rotation. But from the signing of Milt to signing our first big free agent in Darrell Evans, and even though Darrell Evans didn't have his best year statistically for us, he was worth his weight in gold in our clubhouse and in being a leader on our ball club. He was a veteran guy, 39, 40-year-old guy that came over, had some big numbers to bring along with him. I'm sure he would have loved to have been I'm sure he would have loved to have had his best year that year in '84. But, even though he had a steady season, he didn't put up the 30 or 40 home runs like everybody was used to seeing. But his leadership skills, his you know, helping guys out in the clubhouse and out on the field, I think was immeasurable. And Dave Bergman was the same way. Um, when we made that trade for Dave Bergman and Willie Hernandez, you know, I didn't know who Willie Hernandez was. I'll be honest with you. He pitched in the other league. I don't think I ever faced him, or if I did, I never remembered it. Dave Bergman wasn't really aware of much that he did either. But I know that we traded Glenn Wilson and John Walkenfuss, who were two main staples on our ball club. And I felt at that time that they were a part of our nucleus. And I was very surprised that they would be willing to get rid of Glenn Wilson, who was a number one draft pick, and John Walkenfuss, who was like a super utility guy that could do anything, and trade them for two guys that I'd never even heard of, basically. But as it turned out, Willie ended up, having a phenomenal year. That was, and that's when after that season was over, or maybe even during the course of the season, I reminded myself, just keep your opinion to yourself because you don't really know what the hell's going on. So, Dave Bergman was huge, great contributor to our ball club. And he, like Darryl, was a great leader in our clubhouse, a veteran guy that had so many words of wisdom to impart on a young team that was still basically growing in that regard. But they were the ones that helped kind of pull us together as a unit. So I thought that they were both extremely important in that regard. Other than what they contributed on the field. Willard Hernandez, obviously MVP, Cy Young Award winner, had a fabulous year, and a guy that pitched probably more innings than a lot of people realize for a closer. I mean, Sparky didn't hesitate to bring him in, and let him pitch for 2 or 3 innings sometimes. Let alone just come in and slam the door in the 9th inning. So those guys, Rupert Jones came on board during the course of the season. Billy Shear was a guy that we had gotten from Cincinnati, left-handed specialist out of the bullpen that was a big contributor. So, we added to the roster and made ourselves stronger, obviously. And, you never really know what's going to happen. I was very disappointed, like I said, that they traded Glenn Wilson, who was a good friend of mine, John Walkenfuss, good friend of mine. They released Rick Leach in spring training, which I was absolutely shocked by. But he ended up hooking up with Toronto, so I was happy that he was able to keep going. But, I just thought all these guys were going to be a part of the team that actually got it done on the field. But, Bill DeJoy and Sparky and Jim Campbell, whoever else was involved in decision making, obviously felt that there were areas that we needed to improve, and obviously you have to give something up to get something in return. And the moves that they made, I have to say, all turned out to be pretty daggone good moves. So it helped our cause.
I'll tell you, I was looking at it, and in a rare case, that was a rare exception. But Hernandez, like you mentioned, he won the MVP and the Cy Young as a closer.
Right.
And that never happens. And I
Yep.
thought it was a typo. And I'm going, he won both. I was thinking it was the MVP of a series or something. No, MVP of the league and Cy Young. Pretty awesome. And I look up and down your roster and you talk about that because I've been in clubhouses where, the presence of a player is a thing and it transcends the numbers sometimes, not all the time, but having a veteran like an Evans, Rupert Jones, and then I went through the list, and yeah, Gibby's on that team and had a real good year for you that year. Chet Lemon had a great year. A young Howard Johnson playing third base before his Mets years. That kind of, I forgot about that. Obviously, Tram and Lou in the middle infield, which were a staple for a lot of years in Detroit. And then you led the league or led the team that year in homers and RBIs, 33 and 98 respectively. And Jack Morris at the top of that rotation. You talk about a horse, and today's game, we see a little different game pitch. Jack's probably looking at today, go, wait a minute, I'm going out. I'm planning on pitching 9. And then if we're tied, I'm going extra innings.
Yeah.
That was the mindset back then. It's a little bit different. In the 2-hole for you in that rotation, Dan Petrie, who I remember Dan because he went to my high school. Or I went to his high school because I came after him.
Yeah.
But I remember Dan coming back in the off season when I was a kid, My sophomore, junior year in high school. There's Dan Petrie. Oh, he's in the big leagues. He's on the Tigers.
Yeah.
So it was pretty cool reminiscing and going back through that. I look at Kansas City that year. They come in, with the George Brett. You made quick business of them 3-0. You beat Sabes in game 2. I look at Jack Morris. He won game 1. Wilcox goes 8 and beats Charlie Liebrandt in game 3. And then it gets real. And now you got a Padres team coming on. I looked at that Padre team. Garvey and Gwynn and Nettles and Kennedy behind the plate. Goose was the closer on that Padres team. I forget what the Padres did that year. I think they won 92 games. So you're winning 104, different level. But as you know, you get to the postseason, anything can happen.
Right.
A little less back then, which a part of me in today's game, not to sidebar, but I kind of liked the game back then. Those were my childhood days and watching you guys, and it was, man, that 162 game schedule was important
Yeah.
because you had to win just to get to the postseason. Nowadays, you can be, as Arizona proved a year ago, you could play 500 baseball and get to the postseason in 2024. I think it may be a little tougher once you get there because all the landmines you got to go through just to get to the World Series. But getting there nowadays much easier. I think it's more rewarding. Back in those days in the 80s and the late 70s, or man, you play 162 and that's a grind. And when you're standing at the end, you had to beat a lot more teams just to get that postseason nod. So take me, you finish with Kansas City. It's the Padres. You got some star power, obviously, on your team, but there's some pretty good star power on that Padres team. How'd you size them up? And did you feel before the series even start, we're a better team than this Padres team?
Well, I mean, we didn't have interleague play back then, and we didn't. They were training in Arizona. We were training in Florida for the spring, so we never got to see them. I didn't know anything about them. I mean, obviously, I knew who the guys were, but going head to head. They had Tony Gwynn early in his career that year, Steve Garvey, Greg Nettles. The one guy that maybe they missed, I don't know if it would have made any difference, but Kevin McReynolds, I believe, was Rookie of the Year that year, wasn't he?
Yeah,
and he
that's
was
right,
injured.
Kevin McReynolds.
And he was injured for the series, so he didn't play at all. I don't know who replaced him on the roster. I know Bobby Brown got a lot of playing time because McReynolds was not active. But and he didn't have a real good series, so that probably helped our cause. But they had a solid pitching staff, but I think we basically wore their starting staff out. The guys that really gave us fits was our bullpen. We couldn't do anything against their bull. Then maybe they should have reversed the order in hindsight, started all their relief pitchers and threw their starters in at the end of the game because. Every guy they ran out there to start the game, we jumped on them early, it seemed like. And, whatever the score was when the starter eventually came out of the game, they brought their relief guys in and they just slammed the door on us. So for the most part, with the exception of the last game, game 5, when they brought Gossage in and we kind of jumped all over him right at the end with that big, home run that Gibby hit and all that. But, I remember Andy Hawkins when he came in. We couldn't touch him. He was, he just baffled everybody in our lineup. But our guys matched them. Our starting staff did a great job. Our pen guys did a great job. Lou and Allen starting off every game seemed to get on base and get things rolling. So we had it was kind of the way the whole season transpired game to game. Lou and Allen leading things off. They'd either one of them or both of them would get on base, and then we start rolling as a unit. But they got things rolling early on. Tram obviously had that big game where he hit 2 home runs and ended up being the series MVP. But I think everybody contributed. The one thing that I will say about that team from the very start of the season till the end was it made me realize the importance of not only the guys in the starting lineup, but, the guys that were, not everyday starters, that they prepared themselves. They took pride in being ready whenever they were, called to go in and do something. It seemed like every time Sparky asked them to go in and pinch hit or pinch run or do whatever, go in and bunt, they got the job done. So it's very important that you execute and are fundamentally sound throughout the course of the season. And I think those guys solidified our ball club that way. They were amazing coming off the bench when they were asked to do certain things. So I tip my hat to them. They definitely were huge contributors and huge factors in us winning.
I got a question about team chemistry for you and your thoughts on it. I remember as a young player uh, going through the league, and I was probably in the league at the time 6 or 7 years. And remember they said, well, what about team chemistry? And what do you think? How important is it? And I remember at that point in my career, obviously I was a bit naive. I hadn't been through my full career yet. I'm in my late 20s. And my answer was, you know what? I don't think team chemistry has anything to do with anything. I'm from the school that you roll out the best players and you beat the crap out of your opponent. Now, that view has since changed because I've played on a couple teams where I believe that certain guys in a special year on a special team chemistry can go a long way. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I totally agree with you. I'm not sure that is, there obviously have been teams throughout the history of baseball or sports for that matter that the team chemistry always wasn't the greatest. I remember, watching the Yankees all those years when Billy Martin and Reggie used to go at it. They had fights in the clubhouse and fights in the dugout, and guys on the team were going at it and they won. And that's one of those situations where they just had great talent and they won despite of themselves, or in spite of themselves. Uh, our ball club, I think, was the opposite of that. I think we had great team chemistry. I think it started from the top. We had a great coaching staff. Sparky, Roger Craig was an amazing pitching coach and a great leader in his own right. Obviously, that showed itself when he went on to manage the Giants and have the success that he had there. But I think all of our pitchers loved Roger Craig. I think the rest of our coaches were very beloved by our team. The guys, the actual players on our team, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of us went through the minor leagues together. We developed together. I think they always make reference to a team as a band of brothers. Well, in a lot of regards, I felt like that was the case with us. I think we had the freedom, or we felt the freedom, to not only pat each other on the back or encourage one another, uh, had the freedoms to go up and get in somebody's face or hold each other accountable for things that might be detrimental to the success of our ball club, especially in '84. I think that everybody realized early on that we had a chance to do something great, and there wasn't going to be anything that was going to, make us jump that track. So if somebody was doing something off the field that was affecting their play on the field, there was a number of us that weren't hesitant to, go up to that person and hold them accountable. And I think that was expected after a while, that we were on a mission. Nothing was going to derail us, while we were on that mission. So that for me was a great example of team chemistry, that we were all pretty much on the same page. We were all, pulling in the same direction. We all had one objective in mind. And I think we all genuinely love one another. I don't think there's one guy on that team that anybody can say they disliked or, that guy's a bum. And I couldn't wait
He's
for
a
the
bum.
season to get over so I didn't have to, play with him. But, it was just a fun year and it was a fun group of people to be around.
Yeah, that's cool because it doesn't happen, in our game.
Does
It
that
doesn't happen.
translate into wins and losses? I don't know, but
Well, I think there's something to it because you don't, we play this game and obviously you got to be a professional and you have a task at hand and that's to play your position to the best of your ability and
right.
go out there every night at 7 o'clock. But I've been on a lot of teams where when that game ends, now I'll go to battle with you for 3 hours every night, but it doesn't mean that we're going to be buddies and we're going to dinner after the game.
Right.
In fact,
Exactly.
that team, uh, we're a bunch of guys where everybody just got along. And I think you mentioned it earlier on in the show where you talked about coming to the ballpark and everybody was in a good mood and everybody was smiling, from the grounds crew to the guy that probably greets you when you come into the ballpark to
Yeah.
that clubhouse.
Everybody.
And
Everybody.
and it those are special years because that doesn't happen every year.
Yeah.
We have a job to do just like anybody out there in the world. Some years are great, some years aren't great, but you got to be a pro and go through the good. You got to take the good with the bad, and 84 ended up being not only good but spectacular. All right when you guys get together now, that group uh, at the reunion? What's the one story that is a constant?
Well, I think early on it was Jack Morris's no hitter. That was I think the first televised game on of the national broadcast that year. Joe Garagiola and Vince Scully, I think, broadcast Jack's no hitter in Chicago. That maybe going 35-5 at that particular point. Everybody remembers that. Dave Bergman, when he matched up against Roy Lee Jackson in a, I guess you'd call it a pivotal game. It was one of those momentum swinging games that we felt like we needed to win. Playing Toronto in Detroit, it was Dave Bergman fouled off like 13 pitches or something. I was standing on second base actually, and I don't know if it was 12 pitches or third, but it's either the 13th or 14th pitch. He ended up hitting a home run to win the ball game. So it was, and you talk to anybody that was around at that time, whether it be on the team or somebody that comes to these autograph shows, they remember that at bat. I mean, that was kind of a milestone at bat, a milestone game. And I know that every time Dave Bergman was out in public before he passed away, obviously, he was asked about that at bat just about every time. It was a battle, and it was I think something that showed the grit and the tenacity of not only Dave Bergman but our ball club. He just hung in there and battled, and eventually won the battle and hit a 2-run home run to win the game for us. So it's that, and I think you always have to remember sealing the deal, whether it be in Kansas City or in the World Series against the Padres. It was those are the big moments. There were a lot of things that actually happened throughout the course of the year, but those are kind of the highlight moments. So
Very cool, Lance. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Where can the people listen to the Bret Boone podcast today? When's the book coming out? Where can they get it?
The book itself will be released on June 11th, and you can pre-order it on Amazon, or obviously after the 11th, you can again order it on Amazon. It will be sold in bookstores here locally in Michigan. I don't know if you can go to a Barnes and Noble out in California and pick it up. Hopefully, it makes its way out there. But if you can't get it locally at your local bookstore, you can certainly go online on Amazon and get it that way.
Very cool. I got a chance to hang out with your wife here a couple weeks now, probably a week ago now, 10 days.
Yeah.
Arlene, and for those of you listening to the Bret Boone podcast, Arlene is a near and dear friend of the Boone family, probably best friends with Sue Boone, my mom. And anytime she's in town, I always make it a point. I always got to go over and say hi to Arlene. I remember Arlene when I was a little kid running around, and Lance and my dad would be playing against one another. And Arlene back then, that's when the friendship started, and it was cool getting to see her. Give Arlene a hug for me.
I sure will.
And for those of you, here's the book. Oh, wait a minute. Here we go. The Enchanted Season. For those of you watching the Bret Boone podcast now on YouTube, here it is. Enchanted Season. Go pick it up. It comes out June 11th, or you can pre-order it on, like Lance said, Amazon. For those of you listening to the Boone podcast on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts, I appreciate you tuning in. Until next time, keep it here. Thanks, Lance.